Hello and welcome. I'm Shalini Singh, and today I'm here with Subrata Chakrabarty, who's the Associate Program Director for Climate Economics and Finance at WRI India. Today we're going to chat about the recently concluded COP29 in Baku, where he was tracking the negotiations. So let's jump right in. So, Subrata, tell us, what is the breakthrough that we received in Article 6 on day one of COP29?
Yeah. So before I really speak about the big breakthrough that we achieved on the day one of COP29, it is essential that we know the background about it, right? So prior to the beginning of COP29, during its 14th meeting, the Article 6.4 supervisory body, which basically looks over the Article 6.4 mechanism implementation, adopted a few elements that were requested by CMA, that is Conference of Parties, serving as a meeting of parties to the Paris Agreement. And these are the standards on methodology requirements and the activities involving removals. These are the two standards.
Removals of
emissions.
Right. Okay.
Right. These became essentially the supervisory body standards, which means that they are not required to be submitted again to CMA as a recommendations. This is a change in approach, and the Article 6.4 supervisory body requested CMA to adopt this approach. So at COP29 on the first day, the CMA took note of this Article 6.4 supervisory body's adoption of the standards in the opening plenary, but also reiterated that supervisory bodies shall function under the authority and the guidance of CMA to operationalize Article 6.4 mechanism. So that was basically the breakthrough, the adoption of these two standards.
Right. So since climate finance was the theme this year at COP29, tell us about the new finance goals and what were the associated issues with that?
Okay, so climate finance is a very sensitive topic, and rightly so, for both developed and developing countries, right? This is the new finance goal for the provisions of means of implementation, wherein the finance flows from the developed to the developing countries. Before COP29 started, there were 11 technical expert dialogues, 2 high-level ministerials, 3 negotiating sessions under the ad hoc program on climate finance between 2022 and 2024 to discuss the possible elements of new collective quantified goal on climate finance.
Right.
There were many issues, but 3 were very crucial. One is the amount of climate finance, what conventionally people call it as quantum of finance. Second is the contributor base, as in who is going to contribute. And the third one is the source of finance and its quality, right? Whether it will come in form of loan, whether it will come in form of grant, whether it will be a combination of loan and grant, issues related to accessibility. And right from the beginning, there is a clear divide on all these elements between the developed and the developing countries. While developing countries were asking for the quantum that needs to be aligned with the needs of the countries, the developed countries maintained their position that this particular topic will only be discussed once we have some clarity on the contributors base. Right? Developing countries wanted the NCQG to have public financial flow from the developed to the developing countries. In contrast, developed countries again brought out the issue of the contributor base, and they wanted all the actors and not just the developed countries to contribute to this to the pot of money, which includes private sector, multilateral development banks, bilateral agreements on finance, etc., etc. Interestingly, developed countries also brought out this issue where they said that there are developing countries who have seen significant economic growth over the past decade, and they could also contribute
Right.
to the quantum of money under NCQG. So they are basically hinting at petrostates in Gulf and China essentially. The source of finance was also a contentious issue where developing countries wanted the financial flow under NCQG to be largely in form of grants and not in form of concessional loans. And that is because the developing countries, the least developing countries, small island states, they're all bearing the brunt of climate change and its impacts. And they are unable to borrow the amount of money that is needed to fight the climate change impacts. So these are some of the contentious issues which were basically debated very intensely at COP29.
Right. So what did we finally achieve on climate finance? I mean, what are the implications for India out of COP29?
Okay, so the negotiations on this new architecture on climate finance was very intense, to say the least. There were different numbers on the quantum part that kept flowing before COP and during the COP. However, no number made it to the text until 22nd November 2024, which was essentially the last day of COP. And the first figure that appeared was 250 billion US dollars, which was straight away rejected by the developing countries. In fact, there were negotiating blocs like Alliance for Small Island States, AOSIS, and LDCs, who walked out of the negotiations in the, as far as this text was concerned. So what we really achieved on the quantum is a headline number of 1.3 trillion US dollar, but it calls on all the actors,
Right.
which is not limited to just the developed countries, to scale up the finance annually by 2035. We also got a number of 300 billion US dollar per year by 2035 for developing countries, where developed countries will take the lead to mobilize this amount for the developing countries. And the source of this amount is just not limited to public finance, but it includes all the other alternatives of finance, which includes private flow, bilateral and multilateral sources, right? There is again no clear definition of climate finance, which was one of the main asks from the developing countries such as India. Another aspect that went missing is the sub-goals associated with the climate finance, which means the goals particularly parked for adaptation, finance goal particularly parked for loss and damage, etc. They were not included. And again, the adaptation fund was again one of the priorities for India going into COP29. So countries agreed to launch a roadmap called Baku to Belem roadmap on how they can muster this additional, 1.3 trillion US dollars. And in nutshell, we got a quantum for the next 10 years. However, this amount does not come close to what the developing countries were hoping to get out from this COP in order to align the financial flows with their need to mitigate the climate impacts.
Right. So coming back to Article 6, the issue of operationalizing the carbon markets has been at a standstill since Glasgow. We finally have some outcomes. Can you briefly describe some of the decisions that were agreed upon?
Yeah, sure. So before I answer this question, I want to make disclaimers. One, it's a technical subject. So there will be a few jargons here and there. You'll have to bear with me.
We will ask you to decode, demystify it.
Sure.
Okay.
And the second thing is that briefing Article 6 in itself is a challenge.
Right.
Okay. But I'll touch upon 3 or 4 key issues due to which we could not really agree on outcomes in Sharm el Sheikh as well as in Dubai.
Right.
Okay. The first issue is authorization. Okay. Authorization is basically an approval from the host country to transfer the emission reduction as ITMO, that is internationally transferred mitigating outcomes. okay, for specific use by another country
Right.
towards achieving their own NDC or other internationally mitigation purposes, such as international aviation or voluntary mitigation actions, right? So that's the definition of, or the essence of what really authorization means. Now, when it comes to authorization, there were two critical issues. One was whether there will be an agreement on changing or revising or revoking the authorization, and what would be the timing of the authorization. Now, the text that came out, it provides the flexibility, right, to the parties that they can change the authorization. However, the authorization is not applicable to those ITMOs which have been first transferred, which means that the credits have changed hands. So for those credits, the change in authorization is not allowed unless the participating parties or countries have come to an agreement
Can you give
on
us
the
a
terms
short-
and conditions.
Can you give a short example to illustrate what that means? What that could mean?
It means that prior to the authorization, there would be an agreement between two countries
Right.
or two parties
Right.
on the circumstances where they would allow the change of authorization.
Okay.
And this is, we are talking from Article 6.2 perspective,
Right.
which is basically a bilateral arrangement between two countries or the two parties.
Right.
So the change in authorization is allowed with this caveat that we just discussed.
Right.
The second is the timing of authorization, and this has more to do with Article 6.4, right, which is basically the market mechanism,
Okay.
right? So the text says that the timing of the authorization could be between the date of issuance of the credits and prior to the transfer of Article 6.4 emission reduction units in or out of the mechanism registry,
Okay.
right?
Right.
So the authorization can essentially be given prior to that as well,
Right.
right? But this is the last point
Okay.
by which parties have to provide the authorization if it intends to transfer the credits. The second issue with Article 6 is related to interoperability between the registries. So when we talk about Article 6, there are three registries that come into play. One is Article 6.2 International Registry, one is Article 6.4 Mechanism Registry, and the last one is the Host Party Registries.
Okay.
Now, this Host Party Registry is something that some parties may have and some parties may not have. For example, European Union might have a
Okay.
Host Party Registry, Switzerland might have,
Right.
South Korea might have, because they have their internal emission trading schemes going
Right.
on,
Okay.
right? So they do have that kind of a facility.
Yeah.
But there are parties like countries in Africa, other Southeast Asian countries, who might not have that kind of capacity and capability to have their own host party registry. So there are three registries in play. Now, the issue with the interoperability is whether these registries, the international registry and the mechanism registry, they will be used only for pulling and viewing of data and information associated with Article 6.4 ERs and the transactions, or these registries can also be used as a transactional facility. And that is one of the asks from the developing countries, like African Group of Negotiators, AGN, was quite vocal about it. So the text says that such interoperability is possible, and parties can voluntarily join or connect the host party registry with the mechanism registry, and both can be connected with the Article 6.2 International Registry.
Right.
So the interoperability of aspect is covered
Of the registries.
of the registries,
Right.
where the both the aspects are taken into consideration. That is, pulling and viewing of data and information, as well as moving or transferring Article 6.4 ERs to the outside of the mechanism registry as it moves.
Okay.
So that is the second crucial issue
Right.
that was been agreed upon in Baku.
Mm.
The third one is what we call it as application of first transfer.
Right.
Right? And it is crucial because it triggers the corresponding adjustment. That is the adjustment between the emission balance when the credits or the carbon credits change hands.
Mm.
Right? We have two options here that has been agreed upon. One is the definition of first transfer is agreed upon as the first international transfer of the mitigation outcomes. And the second is either at the time of authorization or at the time of issuance or at the time of use or cancellation of the mitigation outcomes as specified by the first transferring party.
Right.
Right? This is the third crucial aspect. The fourth one is related to identifying, notifying, and correcting the inconsistencies. Now, Article 6 enables two consistency check primarily. One is Article 6 database consistency check, and the second one is Article 6 technical expert review consistency check. Because there are multiple reports that the parties will have to submit as far as Article 6 is concerned.
Right.
Right? So many experts believe that the text is weak because there are certain actions that needed to be taken into consideration when there are inconsistencies being found associated with the ITMOs. And the text says that it only requests the countries to not use these ITMOs to achieve their NDCs or other international mitigation outcomes. So the request word is a weak word. So it is left to the parties to honor this particular clause.
Right.
These are essentially the four top line headline kind of issues that were associated with Article 6 on which we achieved outcomes at COP29. So technically it can be said that now the operationalization phase of Article 6.4 begins.
So before we end, please demystify and set the record straight about India calling out the presidency being held at Baku, which we've been reading about everywhere. So tell us about that.
Sure. Well, I was not in the room because I was back in Delhi. But yes, this has more to do with the process because in the spirit of the Paris Agreement is very party-driven process, which essentially means that each and every country needs to form a consensus in order to reach a deal. Now, given the critical issues related to NCQG and the fact that the presidency needed a deal to come out of COP29 to call itself a successful COP, they sort of gavelled down the entire process pretty quickly. And prior to that, when the decision was about to be, presented in front of all the parties, India requested for the floor, and India informed about it to the Secretariat, UNFCCC Secretariat, as well as the presidency, well in advance. But India was not given the chance. That's why they called out the presidency, saying that we have informed the presidency as well as Secretariat to give us the floor, and the kind of process that was followed is not in line with the spirit of the Paris Agreement, and it was hurried and pushed, in a very accelerated manner to get the decision done. And India also very categorically mentioned that India does not accept the decision that has been taken at COP29 as far as NCQG and the quantum is concerned.
Right.
And but the decision has been taken, right? The gavel came down.
Right.
The presidency took note of what India said during the closing plenary. However, I am currently uncertain whether India has communicated this officially to UNFCCC.
Right.
right? And this is probably we would know in days to come. Apart from that, I think everything is there in the news. Nothing new that I can shed light on.
Okay.
But that's the whole
That's
thing
the
about.
setting it
But
straight.
good thing is that India is joined by some other developing countries as well as, like for example Nigeria, who called out the Azerbaijani presidency,
Right.
very very clearly that they do not agree with the process that has been followed. They
Right.
also do not agree with the quantum of the money that has been put on the table.
Right.
Bolivia also came out pretty strong. Bolivia also represents the like-minded developing countries. So they have held press conferences where they have categorically mentioned that until and unless the quantum came into the picture, we are not going to say okay
Right.
to the deal. So they also expressed their disappointments with the process as well as with the outcome on the finance.